Hi everyone, this is David Peters. I was a hospital corpsman, second class back in the old days, and I spent a lifetime 1 year in Vietnam with the 1st Marine Division, 12 months and about 20 days, and this is my story, part 2. So last time we were discussing something called the Sparrowhawk, which was a contingency team set up to resupply units that were decimated through actions in the war that needed resupply of people to do their mission. And I had become part of that when I was assigned to the 1st Medical Battalion in Da Nang. And it gave me a chance to see a lot more about what the Marine Corps does in wartime. And January, I got there, and it was kind of a lost cause at first because they had us painting things and doing perimeter guard with a machine gun with no bullets, and I felt kind of frustrated with that, but you just make the best of everything that comes along. So the Sparrowhawk was very interesting to me, and I never knew if it would be fruitful or not, but as I was part of Sparrowhawk, I would talk to corpsmen. There was one particular corpsman, he was very senior, and he had actually been in Korea as a grunt corpsman, and he told me a lot of things but that I might see out there and some tips on how to treat wounded people and so on. So I took that to heart, and I would sneak into the storage shed for the chow hall and steal stuff to eat. The food they served wasn't very good, but I could get things like canned sardines and delicacies like that. And I would go to this guy and, hey, come and talk to me. Tell me what you think I can learn from you. So I learned a lot of stuff, like he gave me a surgical set with hemostats and clamps and stuff, and I treasured those. And he said, if you get out with the grunts, you're going to need this kind of stuff. Like if a guy gets shot in the and it ruptures his femoral artery, you can't control it with a tourniquet. You have to clamp it. So that's where the surgical set will come in handy. And don't be afraid to stick that hemostat down in there and clamp off that femoral artery, because that guy can bleed to death in about 4 minutes. It was kind of frightening to hear this kind of stuff, but I had already talked to 1st Recon, and we were waiting for an opening, and in the meantime, I was assigned to a medical floor. It was a Hooch. It had a corrugated tin roof. The floor was just plywood, and it had screen sides about halfway up the wall. And we treated things like intestinal parasites and various other infectious diseases that people would normally get in a climate like Vietnam. And whenever a mass casualty would come in, I was able to go down to triage and help there a little bit, and I learned a lot from that. Well, it so happened that the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division, that was based at An Hoa, south and inland from Da Nang, they were scheduled to do a huge search and destroy in an area called the Arizona. The Arizona was a huge area that was pretty well controlled by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, especially at night. And 2-5 was one of the Marine grunt units that was tasked with trying to clean up the Arizona. And so the powers to be had come up with this huge plan to really do some work out on the Arizona toward the end of January. So I hadn't been in country very long. And on January 26th, that was D-Day for Operation Tuscaloosa. Tuscaloosa became quite famous in its day because of the action that they saw there. So the 2-5 was brought out there and dropped off by helicopter, and they started their sweep toward, some people call this the Song Trabong River, and it's got other names, but that was the most common name. And the Song Trabong was very important to the rice growers because it had water in it year-round, and they could irrigate their rice paddies and grow a huge crop of rice. That was part of the problem, because when they would grow the rice, they had such a huge harvest that the Viet Cong would come in and take a lot of the rice that was meant for the local Vietnamese. And it wasn't always that the Vietnamese peasants didn't like the Viet Cong. They tolerated them, but they probably had no more hatred for them, just like they had no greater hatred for the Marine Corps or Army troops. So they started the sweep on January 26th, and they came to the Song Trabong River, and they investigated it very carefully. Well, halfway across the river was a shallow sandbar. They knew that if they got to that and hadn't taken any fire, they were going to be in pretty good shape. What they didn't know was that there was a main North Vietnamese force dug in on the opposite bank of the Song Trabong, and these guys were smart. So the Marines of 2-5 started across, and they ran into a world of hurt. They got out to the sandbar, and the North Vietnamese opened up on them with heavy machine guns and lots of automatic weapons, and it was absolutely horrid to think about the casualties they took. It turns out that in this assault, there was like 29 Marines killed, all their corpsmen were killed, and they needed a reinforcement brought in. So that's when Sparrowhawk was initiated. We weren't supplied very well as being Sparrowhawk members. No weapons were issued. You had a cartridge belt with canteens. You had your medical kit. And they called that a Unit 1. And fortunately, we were able to learn what was in that Unit 1 and put extra things in there that would help us if we're ever in that situation. So they loaded up. There was about 5 of us corpsmen that were part of Sparrowhawk, and they flew us out to the Arizona and dropped us more than a half a mile from the river's edge where the action was happening. And we had to crawl across that land to the edge of the river. It was still fierce, despite the fact that 2-5 had air support in the form of helicopter gunships, F-4s dropping bombs. They also had artillery, mainly in the form of 105 millimeter howitzers that could put in some deadly accurate high explosive rounds into the area that the North Vietnamese were in. And they were doing that, but the North Vietnamese were dug in so thoroughly that whenever a plane would come over to drop its ordnance, they would go underground. And the bombs they were dropping weren't doing the job. So when I got there, got to the edge of the river, it was a drop down into the water of about 3 feet. And it was frightful. Looking back at Camp Lejeune in Field Med School, they did a demonstration one night of a Marine unit and the firepower that it had. And you watched tracers flying across that field at Camp Lejeune, and you wondered how could anything survive with an onslaught like that. Well, the North Vietnamese had something very similar, except this was coming at us. And so you could look out to the sandbar, and there was dead people out there and wounded people, and you knew that was your mission, to get out there and try to save some lives. So you drop into the water, and if you've ever watched a TV show where they're shooting bullets into the water and you can hear them ping, hit the water surface, and then the range once it hits the water, it isn't very far. So if you're underwater 2 feet, you're pretty well protected from a bullet penetrating your body. Thankfully, when I was a kid, growing up in Wisconsin, summertime, the beach was wide open and we went swimming every single day. And I got to be a pretty good swimmer. Plus, the training that we had in boot camp was very, very helpful now, because you knew that you had to stay underwater as long as you could and then come up for a breath of air and go back down to be protected. It was probably 50 yards across from my bank to the sandbar where the casualties were. And thankfully, I didn't have a big pack on my back, because that would have been disastrous trying to swim underwater with a pack. So I go and I would swim as far as I could underwater, come up and take one breath, and the North Vietnamese could see that, and they laid the bullets in on you. It was absolutely frightening. So you didn't waste any time getting a breath. It was up, breathe, and down you go. Fortunately, when I was about 20 yards from the sandbar, they had brought in some F-4s, jets, with new kinds of bombs on them that would penetrate the ground, and it would go underground and explode 3, 4, 5 feet under the surface of the land. And when they dropped those bombs, I mean, I was only like 70 yards from where they hit. And the bunkers that the North Vietnamese had in the banks of that river were solid wood. And the wood came flying out of the ground, along with a lot of dead North Vietnamese bodies. It was absolutely devastating for a kid that had never seen anything like this. War stories on TV don't depict it accurately. But thank the Lord that we had those. And by the time that I got to the sandbar, the North Vietnamese were on the run. They were still shooting, but not nearly as much. And the first casualty I came to was a young Marine that had been shot in the mouth. It was nasty. A lot of blood. And when I got to him, the blood that was in his throat had clotted and he was taking his last breath. Well, fortunately, I had some training in this. My old corpsman buddy told me about this kind of stuff, and I pulled the K-bar off my belt and stuck it in his throat. That was a treatment. You had to open an airway. You couldn't do mouth to mouth because his whole throat was nothing but a clot of blood. So, you know, they call this a cricothyroidotomy. And you go down below the Adam's apple and you stick them in the neck with that K-bar. And one of the things that I always made sure I had was a ballpoint pen that you could take apart. When I penetrated his airway, it sounded like a vacuum. The air floated into his lungs because it was negative pressure down there, and the air floated into his lungs, and he was able to breathe through the hole that I had cut in his neck. So then I took my pen apart, and I stuck the lower end of the plastic pen down into his throat and taped it in place. He was very severely wounded, but he still had the wherewithal to breathe on his own. And fortunately, by that time, the bullets that were flying out toward us were greatly, greatly diminished. And I pulled him up where he was laying on his back, his face and his neck were out of the water, and he could breathe. And I said, "Mister, if you can hear me, I need you to stay right on your back. Don't turn on your side and keep on breathing because I've got to move on now." You know what? I got word in subsequent months that Marine survived, and they rebuilt his face. And I thank God for the ability to have saved his life. It was really remarkable. So we continued on. That was probably the worst casualty that I took care of that day. And by the time nighttime fell, we had already made it across to the bank that the North Vietnamese were holding. It was utterly unbelievable, the devastation that those ground-penetrating bombs had done to that land. And there was a lot of dead North Vietnamese, but not all of them. We treated some North Vietnamese casualties as well. After all, they were human, and we didn't want anyone to die due to neglect. So we continued on. The push was very fast. When the corpsmen got with the regular unit of 2-5, we were all kept back in what they called the command and control center. That's the where the lieutenants and the captains were to call artillery and determine what we're going to do next. So we kept on pushing and kept on pushing. We were getting in gunfights every quarter mile we went, it seems like, but nothing like the initial assault that we found on the river. So there was villages along the way that were Viet Cong controlled. Labatt 1, Labatt 2, Labatt 3. And when we would come within sight of those, we'd be spread out so a grenade wouldn't kill more than one person, or a booby trap. They would scope out the villages and see what was there, and then make the assault on the village. And boy, it was a tough day. You did a lot of walking, you got shot at a lot, and by the time nighttime arrived, we were set up in a defensive position, and it was 50% alert all night long, because we knew that whatever North Vietnamese troops were alive, they were going to be mad as hornets at us for what we've done to them. And nighttime was their time to make a counter assault. And we did. Those Marines were excellent. They couldn't see very good because it was dark, but every so often the artillery that was supporting us would shoot a flare and light up the whole area. And a couple of times we caught North Vietnamese right out in the open. They were staging up to make a huge assault on 2-5. So we made it through the night pretty good. Oh, your dog tired, but you kept on going and kept alert as best you could. And by the time morning came, we were thrilled that we had made it through the night. So this mission, this Operation Tuscaloosa went on for several days, and it was a very successful mission. But we lost a lot of Marines, lost a lot of corpsmen. You happen to have to grow up a little bit in the times like that. And when it was over and they flew us back to 1st Med Battalion, I was glad that I had chosen recon as a go-to unit, because I sure didn't want to do what those grunts were doing for 11 or 12 more months. It would have been devastating, to say the least. So, survived Operation Tuscaloosa, and I have never forgotten it. And that's one reason why I am very glad every single day to be back in America and alive and in one piece. Thank you. What do you think?
Fantastic.